So, well, let's start again. So I'll just remember that David said, just like love, art is passion. Translation is also passion. So translation is a continuum of what you call transformation. So now we still have our passion. So now we're going to welcome our next guest speaker, Professor. I really apologize. So I really need to learn Spanish. Professor Miguel Jiménez-Crespo. So it's our great honor to have you here today. And the title of Miguel's talk is on translation technologies and pandemic emergencies. So Miguel Jiménez-Crespo holds a PhD in translation and interpreting studies in the program Translation and Cognition from the University of Granada, Spain. And he's a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese in Rutgers University, where he directs, it's in the US, he directs the graduate and undergraduate program in Spanish and English translation and interpreting. He's the author of the crowdsourcing and online collaborative translations, expanding the limits of translation studies, published by John Benjamins in 2017, and translation and the web localization, published by Rutgers in 2013. His papers have appeared in the top-tiered translation studies journals, such as Target, Perspectives, Translation and Interpreting Studies, Cognition and Behavior, etc. He has been the co-editor of the John Benjamins Journal, the Journal of Internationalization and Localization. And he's also a member of the editorial boards for several translation journals. So it's our great pleasure to have Miguel here. So thank you so much for coming here at Stirling. You had a long flight last night, arrived late. Anyway, without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. We can get the presentation.
Yeah, the presentation is on. So just
name editing there.
Yeah.
And then
oh no,
it's not sharing anymore. You have to share it again, probably.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay. Here we go. It's because it was there.
Yeah.
We can just start.
So I hide all the floating control.
Okay, let's get it going. Let me see. Can you all see the screen online? Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody here at Stirling University, especially Saihong Li, for the very, very kind invitation. I'm extremely excited to be here. I was a student at the University of Glasgow 27 years ago. I forgot how long it was ago. I was here once in Stirling, like so many years ago. So it's a great pleasure to be here today. And it's also a great pleasure to follow this lecture to Dr. Johnson's too. You mentioned some of my favorite pieces of art, and it was very, very exciting. And my presentation is not very gloomy, but it has to do with the pandemic. We talked about the absence and pandemic. And a year ago, a college, a university in the US asked me to discuss in a presentation what translation in the pandemic. Because there was this question about what's happening with like translating information across the world, and how is it helping bridge the gap in terms of translation and pandemics. And this year, it gave me a chance to go back and reflect. There was not much research on translation studies back then because it was kind of like coming up. But a year after, there's more research and more information, and it gave me a chance to like revisit the topic and expand it and change it. So we're going to discuss this, and we're going to start with when the pandemic started. The magazine Wire, which is one of the most famous like digital magazine around the world, had an article saying that it was translation biggest challenge to date was COVID, right? And right away, he mentioned Google Translate. He said, well, we have this challenge. We have to inform everybody about the pandemic, right? And we have translation technologies, right? And a year after, the BBC kept publishing articles also about how there's languages that defy auto-translate, and he discussed also how there's like 7,000 languages in the world, 100 of them are sort of covered by Google. And if you live in a Western country in Europe, you probably can like use Google Translate or get information easily, relatively easy. We will discuss more of this later, but there's many other languages across the world. So we moved from like media discussing sort of like, oh, machine translation is bad. That was the topic that you can see news frequently of how it helps, to what is happening, what is the gap? The gap was like the rest of the world languages, right? And he was sort of questioning what was translation technology, translation doing to bridge this gap. We're gonna travel to like Papua New Guinea. I just found one example, and this is an article from France at 24, and he said like, yeah, Papua New Guinea has sort of won it says they're the world champion of linguistic diversity, because it's an island that has the most living languages within an island, right? And suddenly, and this was a year ago, I know there's a lot of like this like paper clippings to set the stage. Suddenly, the New York Times published Papua New Guinea had no COVID, and suddenly, boom, there's COVID was ravaging the island. And how do you inform across an island with such linguistic diversity about basic measures, how to protect yourself, etc. And also know that the pandemic at the beginning was how to protect yourself, and then it became how to get vaccinated. And there was a lot more issues about like how to get the vaccine, why to get it, and all the fake news, etc., and how to get the population to get vaccination. There was like 2 stages, I think, with the pandemic, right? If we fast forward, it was like, I was like preparing this, and suddenly the CDC 2 weeks ago said, we have a new pandemic, monkeypox. Since like we're going from one to another. And because I live in Manhattan in New York, you know, I went to the website of New York City, and you can see that the website of COVID, which has been 2 years after, is pretty well developed with human translations of in like 14 languages. The city of New York has like a policy of like depends, but from 8 to 12 languages, they translate everything. So it's Chinese, Spanish, Creole, and some of the languages. And I went to the monkeypox page, and it's only in Spanish, which is also the official policy. When I went to New York, in the US, they have the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and they also have all the Spanish and English information in their page, their human translations, etc. And you can see here it says Español, but we don't have the rest of the information in there. And this is why I prompted these kind of pandemic emergencies and keep moving, because we might not be the last one that we have to go through in our lives. The website of monkeypox, though, now has the plugin by Google Translate. And this is this empty integrations. You've seen that before, that government institutions use websites to disseminate information, health information, and sometimes they use translations in their websites. I work in web localization a lot, and very often you have the plugin, which in my research, I always say that it's zero localization, because there is only the surface of the text that gets translated, and there's many more deeper levels of culture, etc. In there. And there's a recent paper that came up last week. I was working on this by Anthony Pym, and they discussed the translation by Google Translate of some Catalan websites and this website integration, whether that meets the challenge or not of having government using Google Translate in their websites to disseminate information. So what we're talking here is a topic of research that has been pretty extensive during recent years. It's called translation and crisis emergencies. There's a group of scholars in Ireland, etc., that have been working on this. That many of you might know, very famous Dr O'Brien, Federici, and many others that have been working on this and have produced a number of works, a lot of articles, and they have a big European project called Interact Project. So a lot of this research came out of this, and they define initially crisis translations as the linguistic mediations in writing, predominantly, that translators undertake over the duration of crisis with specific commissioning bodies, which we're discussing here, mostly translation in writing, and they mention translators. They don't indicate whether it's citizen translators, professionals, unprofessional, etc. And years after, in a work after, they sort of added another definition in which they consider crisis translation and more of considering that bridging these language barriers in multidimensional cascading effects and that widen existing vulnerabilities or endanger new ones. And they discuss how sometimes there is a crisis. I think one of the words they discuss, like an earthquake. So you have to inform the population of what's happening, but then they can create a tsunami, and then they have another crisis. And many times with COVID, there were crises in which people were locked down. So please stay home because XYZ, and they provide the information to different channels. But then there was no food security. People couldn't access food. And sometimes people were locked at home, and some immigrants communities couldn't know, how do I get the food? And they restored to many like chats and many social, etc. There's a lot of research we've been doing lately on this topic. These crises normally have a rapid evolution. Bowker, in a paper on COVID-19 and information in French, there was French and English in Canada. This is the little, not much time for formal language planning, consensus building in terms of translation. For example, in Spanish, you don't know these, but like there's like 5-6 words for like mask, depending on dialectal variation. In the US, which one do you use? Which to cover your face? You know, they have máscara. One of you don't know Spanish, but there are many, many words that you can use. This technologies can be used or not to assist. So it's never, sometimes you can just get interpreters to help the community by themselves, okay? And there are many questions about who translates, who mediates, which is a different issue. How do you access translators? If you have a crisis and everybody's locked at home, how do you access everybody? We're gonna talk about how people connected through even Google Drive to translate information. How do you access technology and infrastructure? Do you prepare before the crisis? Do you prepare after? And a lot of this was taken care of by this Interact project on crisis translation, about when the crisis happens, that's it. Like, what can you prepare before in terms of many things? I'm going to show you some things after. I'm going to show you before. Crisis translation didn't start, of course, with COVID, which is the biggest that we've had. I'm going to show you, there was like a project called Usahidi that in the book that I worked on crowdsourcing translation, that was from several years ago, I studied a lot the response to the Haiti earthquake, which is a classic example of how this crisis translation started. And there's a lot of work done nowadays by Translators Without Borders. I'm sure you know them. And there's been a lot of research done on them. They do have a platform called TICO Translation Platform. I'm going to show you later some of these responses that they had and how they help mediate. But we're going to go back to one of the seminal and the first sort of responses that I found very fascinating in crisis translation. There was this earthquake in Haiti, right? And a lot of buildings were destroyed, and there was a lot of issues, and there were a lot of people asking for help. And there was this platform called Usahidi that already exists. There was a geolocating platform. It was used in Kenya to like pinpoint the map. So citizens could pinpoint in the map where there were like violations, problems. So you could get in the map, go on a map and pin it and say, here something is happening, right? So the platform existed, and it was sort of a crowdsourcing platform with citizens who just go to the internet. And luckily in Haiti, the cell phone towers were up. So there was an earthquake, there were problems, but the cell phones were working. So people started sending text messages, you know, my child is dying of, you know, like dehydration right here. I need water immediately or my child will die. It's an example, right? And Munro, one of the scholars, created this plugin to use this platform to geolocate the text messages and try to get the text messages to be translated around the world. So they will indicate the location, and people from, this is the where around the world, the diaspora that spoke like Haitian Creole, helped translate these messages. You can see clusters around New York, in Los Angeles, somewhere in Europe, but you know, also in China, and pretty much everywhere you could log in, get a text message and translate it. Why? Because the Red Cross, everybody was coming from other countries, could not read the text messages. So there was a way to get these Creole messages translated so that the international helpers would like know what was happening in there. And they did not only translate, so the task was for people around the world to translate a message, okay, to categorize what was the problem, in there because some are more urgent than others. Okay, and also to math. So basically, you can put right here in this intersection, there is a child that needs water, for example. Let's say this is what they did it. But that was in 2011, and this became like one of these examples of classic of how technology and translation can mediate to help in crisis. We need to discuss now because now most of the times when we talk about crisis translation is what is the difference between human, machine translation, what kind of data, what do we need to prepare, and what happened with COVID. And there was a lot of initiatives with COVID to try to mediate this gap, lots of them. We're going to sort of discuss them briefly, some of them. And when I talk about translation technologies, I always use this division between macro and the macro and the micro. That started with Minako Hagen. But then in terms of like the macro is the level in which technological world changes. Now we'll have cell phones with data, but 10 years ago we didn't. So now sometimes people translate, I don't know if you've seen, for example, Unbabel, you can translate and make some money translating on the phone, okay? And in Africa, people have more cell phones than computers. So sometimes some initiatives, they pay cell phone credit to help translate into languages of lesser diffusion. So you basically translate some text messages and this data goes into development of machine translation, right? So the technology changes everything. And the micro is how the translation itself changes, right? Which is you can have translation memory, machine translation, both of them. I don't know if you know LILT nowadays, and machine translation is integrated with translation memory. So you either get translation memory or you get a machine translation and you post edit. So you can get either or. Machine interpreting, there's a lot of work doing this. We're not going to discuss this because it's like complicated. I was in several conferences this summer and there's a lot of very exciting research. This is what USAID, what I mentioned about Haiti before would be the crowdsourced translation platforms. This platform that exists can help citizens translate. And there's also a lot of subtitling, captioning, voicing technologies. And in COVID, it was very, very important because there are languages that are not written, for example. In Latin America, a lot of the response was to create radio messages that would repeat on the radio rather than like, you know, the web, you know, papers, something that is delivered. There was also videos. In many cases, there were a lot of YouTube videos that were created. There's repositories of this that you can go by language and see what kind of resources were created. And in many cases, it was like either revoicing technologies, captioning, etc., to be delivered via videos, via the TV, on the radio, etc. So here we have a crisis. And this is sort of like the trifecta of, it's very basic. Some of you know translation technologies might be very basic, but if you have the memory, machine translation, and crowdsourcing, and they all feed each other, okay? Because you need different data, but the response for COVID, some initiatives were like for one or the other. Some people work on crowdsourcing translation to try to get citizens to help. In some other cases, let's just create memory so that it can fasten the translation process, but it can also be served to develop machine translation. And in many other cases, there was a lot of machine translation. And nowadays, if you look in recent years, there was a lot of initiatives for many, many languages that didn't have machine translation for COVID before. At the beginning, it was like Spanish, English, you know, the biggest languages that had it. And we need a lot of data. I don't know if you know these international standards, but basically, because I'm going to show you later the response. So you can see that in many cases, it was like, let's create, you know, translation memories to help assist in the translation, in the human translation, or the terminology databases. Nowadays, if you go to IATE, you go to the Spanish government, any government, there you will see a lot of the World Health Organization, a lot of terminology databases that exist that are highly curated, they're excellent, and for COVID, and etc. But they didn't exist at the beginning. It was sometimes there were citizen initiatives, sometimes there were like scholars, sometimes there were translation scholars. This create like a glossary in all these endangered languages. For machine translation, the same. You need the TMX to train. You need human translations to buy there, and a lot of them. You need the system. You need the training, the model needs to evaluate, and some of the initiatives work on all these, and you develop pretty quickly. And for citizen translation, you need people, participants. The last one, volunteers. Because when I was working, you know, my book some years ago was on crowdsourcing. Sometimes people ask me, how can we motivate volunteers to do something. It's like, I don't have the key. People have to be motivated by themselves. Sometimes they gamify the platforms, but in COVID, everybody was at home. It was such an emergency that it was easy to get volunteers to help assist absolutely everything in that case. And you need a management system that is very important. And you can use all of them. In some cases, some initiatives, you get machine translation, and that would get then post-edited by volunteers, which is some of the initiatives that were done, some platforms, and then that would be disseminated, for example. And the response can have more technology, less technology. I'm talking about technology, but we cannot forget the human factor. Because this is still, for many languages, it's still like a desiderata, like we don't have fully automatic machine translation for many languages. Of course, that was if you go back to the beginning when I show you, when the newspapers and the news, they were discussing what happens with like all the other languages, not just the major languages, right? And you have also somewhere in the middle, like keeping in the loop, which is post-editing or crowdsourcing. This is what I've mentioned already. And I'm putting this the more on the less, because in some cases, the only response is the human translation, right? There is a fabulous website that I love called the Endangered Language Project. And they have, I don't know if you've heard of it, but they basically documented every single piece of information in all the not the endangered languages, I would say the languages of lesser diffusion. And you can help me to find, I was working again to try to find a term, and I'm going to show you in a minute about this. But you can find, this is Temne from Sierra Leone, the language. It's very familiar, all these little pictures. So basically, there were some templates that around the world that we tried to get in as many languages and possible. The problem with human translation is that it takes time, it's slower, who translates, and very often this is something that gets forgotten, a content prioritization and what gets translated first. So getting a pipeline. And of course, in COVID, you know that the first thing that got translated was like the little brochure that have the basic information about the facts, right? And also how is the translation going to be delivered? And for many cases in many communities, as I said, and there's low literacy, you cannot read. And this is why sometimes it was right away decided, let's do videos for indigenous languages in the US too, actually within the US, or let's do it in Latin America or in Southeast Asia or some other places. So it was, the radio was supposed to be the best one. Or sometimes best messages. I'm going to show you the text box later. And this started also with Ebola. This is from Translators Without Borders. They have an initiative for the Ebola that was more like limited, okay, within Africa. But you can see the same pattern of like this kind of semi-graphic, multimodal information. And they were translated into many of these languages. And I found this, but this is like 2 days ago. I was like, what about monkeypox? Where can I find, if you go back for a minute, about how this health literacy gets spread, okay? And there's these basic brochures of like basic facts about information that we translate into some languages. And this is from the Department of Health of California. And that's the place where I found in the US the most diverse. I guess in Vietnamese, monkeypox is monkeypox. That's Vietnamese, Cambodian, Arabic. They have like 12 languages only. But in many cases, in Australia, in the US, and Canada, I'm aware of how language policies work within the communities. But in the US, it depends very often in the government, in the kind of policies. In New Jersey, I work in New Jersey, what kind of the languages are translated into. The same that I showed you before for COVID for New York. In this human versus machine translation, as you say, probably the brochures that we saw were probably human. This is a paper at the very beginning of COVID when the first initiatives, and they were there from Ireland, from the Dr University, they were working and they developed some right away, a COVID machine translation system to help with that. And they were talking about right now, the volume of translation, human might not be the answer. Let's try to be for timeless and the cost. They discussed the cost. And still today, there's this, tens of agencies like, do we go fully machine translation and how they can combine themselves? And I chose the quote just because they express, well, we can develop machine translation. It was the early days, but as you saw little by little after, yeah, into Spanish, into French, right, Arabic, but what happens with the rest of the world? And you saw how the pandemic incrementally went from China, Italy, Spain, the US, and it grew exponentially like global, and it still is actually around the world. For machine translation, I don't know if you've seen this. This is a very basic. This is like Sesame Street that I show my students sometimes. Like you have good data, good training model, you get better results. And right now, neural machine translation, the major players like DeepL, Google, Symantec, and many others, they have excellent results nowadays, as you know. And there's the possibility of like adapting the engines to different specializations, etc. So the results are pretty good. But if you don't have very good data, and I put this because later there's some initiatives like the Taos initiative, in which they collected huge amounts of data, but then it was found out the data wasn't the best. It was like an emergency quick fix, but the data wasn't the best to train, etc. the neural machine translation engines. And of course, if you have a lot of languages and there's no data, we can create synthetic data. As I said, in many initiatives in Africa, they've been doing like trying to get through SM messages to create corpora to train the engines, etc. So there are many initiatives around the world to work with this one. And the progress is a lot. This is from 2016. I don't know if you know that. That's around when neural machine translation started. So there's still a lot of issues. And as I said, and this keeps, when I go back to research on translation technologies and COVID, it gets to the topic of how to extend, rather than improving the quality that we have right now in Western languages, is like how we stand probably to the rest if we have another global emergency, which is pretty important. That's one of the problems that I saw that we find. For example, this is like Sistrans, which is one of the largest companies in the world for machine translation. If you know that, they only have like 12 engines. They train with COVID. This is another Never Labs. This is another initiative. This is a private company that right away when COVID happened, they released an engine. They were like, everybody can use it. And you see these French, German, Italian, Spanish, and Korean. We go back to the same point that I've been making throughout the presentation. And I work in localization, and this is what you can help me if anybody has an idea. Sometimes I mail them in the industry. They call it long tail languages. Sometimes I call it languages of lesser diffusion. And in the project that you saw before, they call it endangered languages. This is the project that for all these languages, if you have any better term for it, we can discuss that. But there is something, because I work in web localization, a lot of the information travels through the web nowadays, mostly for health literacy. And years ago, Schaller, which is also based in Ireland, and asked them to discuss the notion of development localization, or how access to information or content in a digital world shouldn't be restricted or depending on anybody's income, or how we need to make an effort to remove digital divides in that sense. And there's a lot of issues with this one. And in machine translation, this is another name. So they avoid, you have asked you about the name. They call it low resource machine translation. So it's not about how many speakers of a language, how spread language might be, whether it's written, not written, it's oral, whatever. It is more like, do we have resources or we don't? Because that becomes the issue of data in machine translation. They call it low machine translation. And it started like 15 years ago. It's not anything new. They call it crisis machine translation. And it's the same scholars. Munro is one of the same scholars that did the Haiti response. So when the whole Haiti earthquake started, that I mentioned about the text messaging and the Creole, it was the same. And they called it crisis MT. And nowadays, still, they said that with O'Brien, that fully reliant, we know from the private industry perspective of professional translation that relying for legal, marketing, health, and information on machine translation is very, very risky, right? There's cases of like, instructions for a pacemaker were translated with machine translation, what happened, right? And there is the what do we do? Like in machine translation, we have the fit for purpose quality. Is the quality good enough? But is anything good enough if the life of a community is at stake, right? So this is what they discuss, the issue of mixing humans, preparing before, doing post-editing, etc. And there's more issues there. There's a lot of writing here. It's two slides that have a lot of writing on them. But it's like, for the neural machine translation, we need huge amounts of data. And we need data that's specialized. And sometimes they discuss the notion of domain mismatch. This is that one here, meaning that for some languages, the only corpus is the Bible. Because I don't know if you know, the most translated website, localized websites, is, for example, the Mormon Church website has the most, like 1,400 languages, 1,420. I forgot the number. So for some languages, the only written data corpus is, for example, the Bible. For others, very often, they use legislation. You know, to train machine translation engines, we use a European Union or whatever is available on the Opus corpus. So there's a domain mismatch, and there's also the notion of creating synthetic data. That I'm not going to go to in depth. There's a lot of initiative in machine translation to go work with long-tail languages, although they call it low-resource machine translation. And last week, there was a paper that came up from, there's a lot of hype. I deleted that slide about industry hype on machine translation, right? Hype versus reality. Because sometimes, you know, like Microsoft will publish, we reach human parity, right? Translating English and Chinese, you know, machine translations. And there's a lot of paper lately about debunking by Andy Wang and others about debunking that. But Meta created a new engine, and they call it, the initiative is called, Meta is like Facebook, etc. They call it No Language Left Behind. It covers 200 languages. But it's created a new system not to go one-on-one, but go between all languages. And it's also, when I was reading the paper, I found it interesting that they mentioned, in fact, what I mentioned before, that in some countries, cell phones is how people access information rather than, or like even SMS. And therefore, they integrate that with, like, for example, SMS. So it's not just for like to translate it, you know, automatically on Facebook, your post or information, but also to make sure that information can be delivered there. And there's many issues. I told you there's a lot of text in here, but I'm sure you know many of them. There's issues with quality and fit for purpose. So like, you know, what is fit for purpose translation, which is a big issue, mostly in health, okay? And I have a gentleman that we invite, that created the exam for code interpreting in New Jersey. I always invite them. He always comes and asks the students right away. He asks the students right away. Hope he's not listening. He always writes right away. Like, if you were caught in Thailand and you had core, how much information you want to know about happening in the core? 100%, 80%, 70%, or 50%. And the students are like, 100. If you were going to be in jail 20 years, how much you want to know, or what quality, right? And the students say 100%. And then they say, well, the exam, 80% is the max. And they're like, oh, what happened with 20%? And here we have in the threshold of fit for purpose data, you know, when your life in an emergency is at stake, or lives, many lives, etc. And how much data. There's bias, and I put some here, and there's something that have been covered lately, but yeah, there's a lot of ethical issues. There's papers about translator without borders lately, and I'm going to go into accessibility and whether the content is accessible. And the paper that just came out, like that I read a week ago by Anthony Pin, they discuss of how machine translation goes to the information. If there's a lot of pictograms, for example, right? Like there's a website and you have all these photos or pictograms to describe information, and those don't get translated because like the machine translation has access only to the text that is in XML content, right? There's a conference on this translation of medical information and multimodality in Spain, like in a month or two, and it's quite interesting. And also about literacy, you know, we can translate all we want. This is what I mentioned before, the right away. Sometimes the mode of delivery was videos on YouTube or like radio because of literacy, etc. And also the issue of empty literacy. And this is what we go back to the very beginning about how the news, where they don't know how to use machine translation. They don't know what's happening, right? And when to use it, when not to use it, etc. I think that's it for this part. I have like 2 more minutes, but like the Interact project that I mentioned to you, one of the solutions that they have is to create this series of courses on post-editing machine translation to get ready for readiness, right? To prepare before. And they're all on YouTube and you can access them. So one of the solutions is relying on machine translation engines, if they have one engine, one system, right? And with human post-editing, but also we have to go back to the fact that, for example, in a survey of European companies, 59% said that they don't use machine translation yet, post-editing. So we tend to think that post-editing, machine translation professional is more spread than it might actually be in some purposes. And as I said very often, in many cases, for highly critical material like health information is not recommended, of course, etc. And now I just want to show you some of the initiatives very briefly that happened right away. As I mentioned before, there was a huge response. We were all at home, locked down, and there was a lot of responses from many scholars, research teams, academia, industry partnership to try to bridge the gap. And I just want to briefly show you, this is more like I want to show you some of the initiatives that happens in there. Translation Without Borders, TAOS, I don't even know TAOS, etc. And I'll show you. One of the first one that I found was from the CDC from Korea. I forgot the name of it, but they did the most, what we could consider the most low tech. This is called COVID Translate Project. And they basically did post-editing with volunteers in a Google Drive, in a shared Google Drive. This would be what we do in the classroom sometimes. We would be, in the case of an emergency, the most, like, I wouldn't say low tech, but it was the fastest possible that could do. But they translated the instructions by the CDC of Korea into many languages. They could. There are like 7 languages. Sorry, I said many, but there were like 7. Further along, Translated Without Borders came, and they have a platform called CATO. The platform CATO is a platform that mediates between participants, sort of a crowdsourcing. Everybody can get in, you can accept it, you can translate, and they publish like a graph. And you can see this in 2000 about how around July 2020, there was like a peak. So there was a lot of volunteers translating information in 106 languages, and they haven't updated this one. Still, we go back, if you look at the graphic, French, Spanish, Arabic were the most translated languages in there. But they did put their platform to use to get as much COVID information, because you can get as many citizens, translators, or volunteers, even when Translated Without Borders accepts mostly professionals in that case. Okay. And they also published, if you haven't seen, they published there's 2 or 3 initiatives. That right away, one initiative was to publish, as I mentioned before, translation memory and glossaries in TVX format. And they published also a huge amount of glossaries in TVX format that you can download in there. These are I can say the language, African, Albanian. This is from the A, Bambara, Bangla, etc. You can see that they compile them. They didn't produce them, they sort of compile them, okay, from other sources. And then this is very cool initiative, and that they publish a lot. Chatbot against COVID was basically, rather than translating, it was a chatbot that if you could ask questions in your SMS, you could get back the information. Why wear a mask? What do I have to do? And they translated into several languages in the Republic of Congo. French, Congolese, Swahili, Lingala. And they wanted to add more soon, but I think I haven't read any more research about this initiative, but it was more like natural language processing, etc., to get information. Another one that was a big one, a big initiative was, this was called TICO 19, TICO 19. And it was like Amazon, Google, Facebook, some of these large corporations and some universities. And they produce, we go back to the trifecta that I showed you before, this triangle that I showed you before. They produce translation memories, terminologies, and a benchmark for machine translation. So they were sort of delivering all the information they had as much as they could to help develop a technological response to COVID together. The TMX memories, remember the TMX can serve for translation memory or also to train engines, machine translation systems. They have 30 languages, and they also have a lot of combinations. So they have all these different combinations, such as Bengali, Indonesian, that I found interesting, and all terminology databases. But again, we go back to the 37, and this is called TICO 19. And they also have glossaries, and these were actually from Facebook and Google. It was interesting that they released all these glossaries. TAOS, this is called the Translation Automation Society. I don't know if you've heard of it. Very, very large. And they also have this initiative that they also put their platform, I would say, their presence in the world as a translation technology. How we call it? It's not an initiative, translation technology. I can't find the word for how to define TAOS at this point. But it's like a think tank, I would say. And they requested, please send us your translation memories. We'll compile them, right? And they created something called the Corona Crisis Corpus, which is like, don't give me small translation, whatever you have already. Because remember, to train a system, for example, machine translation, you need huge amounts of data. So if you so they request, send everybody who can, please send us everything you have. And they created all these French, German, Spanish, and Italian only. So we go back here. The Russian was from some medicine, and it was widely used around the world. One of the problems they found with the TAUs is when you ask everybody, please send me your translation memories immediately. People sent just sort of medical translation, whatever they had. And it wasn't sometimes very specialized. So the results were not like that good. Because as I mentioned, that's what I put the graphic before about like if data doesn't fit a lot, the results might not be that good in the end. So they found there was a lot of corrupted data, duplicated data, mistranslations and translation errors, etc. Because they were basically translators just sending their translation memories they had at home. But with that data from this data, since Trans, which is a company, machine translation company, one of the largest in the world, as you know, I'm sure you've heard of it, they created something called the Corona Crisis Translation Model. So they basically got all that data from the TAUs and they created the model so that you could export it and have it free back then. It's not available anymore, I think. I tried to go and I couldn't work. I was trying to like retest it again. And I did just a simple text. I got like one Mexican page for the Mexican government. So the Mexican government has like a CDC, the Department of Health, Ministerio de Salud from Mexico, and I just copied the first Parafina page and I put it there. This is from a year ago. I was trying to test it again, but I couldn't find it anymore. They have it, but it goes back to the one model. And because this was, they had it for free because this is a paid company, of course. And they had it for free, so anybody could go in there and like use it for the Corona corpus. And as I said, they use the data from TAUs, right? And they have something that I love that I don't have it anymore. That is very interesting. They have sort of like, I want to show you in a minute. So you have the machine translation. It looks similar. You have statistical, but they have the machine translation, and they offer the translation with all their engines, meaning that you could compare, like, see what's going on with different engines. And I blew it up here, and this is a random thing. I did not select it on purpose. It was just like, and it was basically some sentence in Spanish saying, what can we do in the time we have left in the COVID pandemic until a safe vaccine arrives, right? And it was not, the performance was not very good. But I like that it's not there anymore. As I said, it's not there anymore. It was like this critical response in that you could see this is with the TAU's data, you have a translation, and then they will like model IT, the generic system, which is like probably we'll get with DeepL, like or Google, we have the generic one. Remember, these companies specialize, you can pay them to specialize the system for any company. But still none of them, you can see the changes from the top to the bottom. But still the translation wasn't that good anymore. And I think that's it for me. Oh, no, there's one more. This is the last one, man, I think. It is basically that there is this model. It was published by the industry called the augmented translation. I'm not sure that I believe on the terminology of augmented translation. There was like Dr. O'Brien in this conference this summer gave a lecture on revisiting the augmented translation sort of paradigm, in which you can see that the response was like to get. I have another graphic that I multiply these to have like 100. It looks too messy, but it's the same. Is to have the translator at the center, the human at the center, and be sort of assisted in the sense you can have. We have an emergency crisis. Let's do terminology, and we can help with the terminology. We have to be consistent. We can have, machine translation system, but the human can check it through post editing, right? We can have translation memory if we don't have that one, whatever, or we can have automatic content enrichment. Okay, that would be, I would assume, getting information. There's a lot of those. They haven't used. I haven't found any of this one in the response. And then the project management will be all these platforms that have help. Like USAID will be an example. Okay, sort of like lots of project management mean that no human is involved. Like you put a text, the system kind of breaks it up in chunks. For example, it goes to people translate. Then you can have revision or not. Somebody will revise them, and then they get recomposed and then delivered, and they can be published in a page. Right? That will be lights out. But there's a huge number of systems now. For crowdsourcing, there's a lot of companies, and a lot of like either paid or free that you can use to have initiatives to get citizens around the world to translate this a lot. And the customer will be, I'm not sure how. This is an industry model, as I mentioned, right? And pretty much that's it. There are assets in emergency crisis. Are you seeing there's some shortcomings and some pluses and minuses yet? We need a lot of data. So for preparation, we need the technologies and the system. And we also need these crowdsourcing systems. And I always think about it, like what will happen if the internet will break down in an emergency, in a global emergency tomorrow? There's like boom, and there's no internet. Because like, or no electricity. This is like something that I don't want to think about. But we will go back to something else. I think we'll have to go back to like Egyptian time, you know, interpreting, trying to mediate for interpreting, human interpreting in that case. But there's a continuum from high quality. It's always like, is the high quality always necessary to fit for purpose? And I think sometimes it goes to the point of content prioritization of what kind of content is highly critical, less critical, or what can we just do it. And this is something that I get lost sometimes. And this is not very hopeful, positive, but it's like as good as they can at this time, they do perform and they create a great service. And to finish with, this is my favorite thing that happened with the pandemic in terms of translation. I've been collecting them around the world in terms of like, I think that nobody has seen a grizzly bear in person. So I don't know if you can, these metaphors, I was talking to metaphor to one of the students. I don't know which one it was, about metaphors in translation. But grizzly bear or moose antler, I have no idea. 2 picnic tables works for me. So again, this is like pick your own metaphor kind of thing. Because like my favorite author in the world is the one with the kangaroo. Okay, and that's it. Thank you very much.
For your really interesting talk.
My pleasure.
Actually, I did a bit of research related to that as well. One of my articles contributed to crisis translation or translating hazard will be coming out very soon. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think instead of me, I will just invite if anyone else would like to ask any questions. Yes, David.
Thank you very much for that. I've learned a huge amount. Of course, if you see a grizzly bear, you're much more than 6 feet apart. Clearly, we're going to be facing more crises, you know, for obvious reasons. And ideally speaking, we should be planning a translational response to that. Who's the we and how do we plan that response? What would be the mechanism for planning that response in terms of public action?
That's why I mentioned several times for example, the grant Interact, in which you have to be a partnership to prepare between institutions, and they have to do. I mean, there's a huge field of study called crisis management in general, and crisis communication, which is different. This is like some of the projects you communicated, so you have to be like a partnership between institutions, research teams, and also communities, because there's also like communities that get the response. I was reading yesterday about how in Canada, I think that was a paper from Desjardins about how there was these like, you know, meltdowns in Canada about like translating, etc. So the government, I hope it's the right paper, they released like 14 million for like communication response. Okay, about 2 million of them were for translation, and then I think 12 million were for like crisis communication management. So it is an issue of where the resources are allocated, but there are initiatives in place in different, because it depends often in language policies.
Yes.
So it is a sort of delicate issue, but there's step incremental step being prepared. And I think the more technologies, for example, in the sense that we mentioned, that we have ready, like how to mobilize quickly a crowd to help in an emergency, right? Where we have the system available, that is something that can help in this case. But I know that.
The reason why I ask is clearly there are some political cultures which are more language aware than others.
Yes, of course.
And at the time of the Grenfell Tower disaster in London, there was a totally inadequate response because nobody knew how to mobilize or where to look. So the reason why I asked is that there seems to be no concerted global response to this. It needs to be rooted, perhaps, in some sort of campaign for language awareness within a political body. Or
yeah, I totally agree. This is part of the work that I mean, I don't work on crisis management myself in that case, but there is this concerted effort to include, when crisis communication, this crisis management, etc., to include always translation and multilingual communication. I have prepared beforehand, knowing a community, which languages are spoken, who is in the community, but have that ready before, the same as you prepare ambulances and you stockpile. The US has like 200 million monkeypox vaccines in case of one of those, how you call it, a terrorist attack or like a war. So if you have vaccines or you have whatever for the population, or you have masks, let's say, let's have the language response ready. But you also have to know who is going to need it, which languages are spoken in each community, etc. So you need to have that prepared already.
Sorry, I'll finish that. But that was the central problem with Grenfell Tower. In terms of a risk analysis, in terms of fire, nobody knew the languages that were present within that problem.
That is very common in communities about the papers that come out from Canada, from Australia. There's one for PM about how 240 languages are spoken in Melbourne, for example. How you prepare, for a crisis response in COVID for that one. To create trust too, because very often many communities, not just that, it's also to create these papers on trust, because sometimes communities don't trust the government because they haven't helped them in the past. How you create the trust, etc. So there's a large amount of issues around. But thank you very much.
Sure, thank you very much for the question. So anyone else? Or also I think it's at the audience online. Does anyone else have any questions? Richard, can you see if anyone else have questions?
No, there aren't any. No one is raising their hands.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions from Bilibili or in our meeting?
We're waiting. Well, we have a question here. So, okay. Yeah.
I do have the belief that machine translation will replace translator in the future. How do we translators to react to the trend, or how do you think about such trend?
Okay. I think they will not. And it has to do with like intelligence, and it's recent papers, or like I was reading about the difference between whether AI, artificial intelligence, is intelligent. In fact, they're basically replicating patterns, right? They're learning from patterns, and there's something else human. And my approach, for example, to teaching, and I'm going to go to my experience teaching machine translation, post-editing, for example, is to focus on, and I give a couple of lectures with cows, is to focus on the human aspect that they can't. So I never, for example, work on post-editing to like, do light post-editing of this text. I never do that with my students ever. I do a light post-editing that will be published in Argentina. So you need to have Argentinian, and you need to explicitate some of the concepts, or do 2 different post-editings, one for citizens that are living in a community, like you say, in a building in London, and one for people that are abroad. And so I always do creative issues. So it's a focus on what parts of crisis, and I didn't mention it here, but in crisis communication, they also discuss cross-cultural communication. Not all cultures are gonna accept, please get 2 doses of vaccine face, right? Because of trust. So you have to reach, so it's the cross-cultural aspect are there. There are many more, but I could expand, but I hope that answers your question.
No, I won't ask questions. We'll get a chance to talk.
I hope that answered the question, but there's huge amount of issues that humans can do, both within the language, we talk about language industry, the creative issues, and within translation that I guess machines will not be able to do. And this article that came out last week on the op-ed, the New York Times, I like that. We was talking about like how we shouldn't call artificial intelligence because it's not intelligence. We have to discuss what is intelligence per se, etc. So, but we can talk about that.
Sorry, Professor Miguel, we have an audience from the meeting room who has question. Her name is Clara. I believe it's Chongyu. Okay, So can you speak?
Of course, I know her, I think.
Okay. So Clara, can you ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, Miguel. It's nice to see you. Across the screen. So as usual, your talk has been it's very informative, but I apologize that I don't think I can open my turn on the camera, so I would just ask you the question. You talked about it, so the question is mainly about quality in the context of the use of transition technologies and mobilizing volunteers, as you've referred to the publications from the Interact team a lot, like Sharon and Federico. So the question is really that, the crisis is also contextual, and especially in terms of the low language resource MTs, like those minority languages in a particular locale, both organizations such as NGOs, the governments, or for example, the Haiti earthquake, they translated and then used the text messages. So that all in a lot of instances, they all rely on volunteers and in the crowdsourcing mode. But we know that the quality is always an issue, and also the fluidity, the ad hoc nature of the sole reliance on the volunteers. So I wonder, but whereas, even though, like you mentioned, a lot of those initiatives to translate COVID information between different languages, but in the case of some really minority languages, there is no enough data, no enough professionals. We know that it's garbage in and garbage out. So I wonder if you come across any to elaborate on that a bit more on the quality assurance. But of course, there are different degrees of the quality. And then in relation to that, for example, from some of the initial observations from a new project, is that a lot of those community members who speak minority languages, they prefer to receive the information in a multimodal manner, like the pictures, graphics, which you also mentioned, and they don't actually go to those websites. They trust the community leaders. They go to their social media, or they even use the WhatsApp. So those are the two things that I don't know if maybe I was just rambling. So those are the two things that I would like to see what's other thoughts that you may have. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to talk to you and Clara. The issue of quality is an issue that always comes back, and it's also I think it's sometimes on some iteration of this presentation I might have the triangle of time, quality, and money. Okay, in the sense that you can't have everything in an emergency, even in business I say commercial settings, you can sometimes have everything at the same time. And this is the movable target of that we always fall for, as translators, for this kind of critical content of this critical situation, some children need a rapid emergency, and it's good enough, which is the fit for purpose. If we have that one, and there are a lot of ethical issues and moral issues involved in there. But if we say we have this crisis and we need to have 200 professionals right away to the very best quality, and this is where I put the quote by machine translation scholars that say we don't have time for to mobilize people, and this is the moving target. And I think that a solution in terms of both, and also this is what I also brought up, Bowker and machine translation literacy, in the sense it is also necessary to educate the public, scholars, institutions, etc., on how good they can perform at a point in time. When can you use it? When can you not? Right away. To do decision charts quickly. For this type of thing, don't use it. Try to mobilize something else. And it is a very interesting concept, but as I say, it brings a lot of ethical issues. And in terms of quality, Clara, for example, the one for SM messages, it was basically the Red Cross was in Haiti, the international headquarters, and they were receiving all the messages and they don't know what to do with them. Imagine you want to help, and then suddenly you're getting 1,000 text messages of alerts and you don't know what's happening with them. What do you do? And this is like how do you bridge that gap? The more we prepare, and this is what I think that scholars that work in this field like extensively and develop systems, etc. And I think there's a multi-response is to get the crisis. You mentioned also social media, and it's true that many communities might not building trust. There's several papers that came out later about building trust in case of emergencies, about how some people, if they don't get the message, they will go to like social media and try to figure out a reputed leader, and they will follow that. And it's important that misinformation doesn't get also passed down through leaders in communities. Go ahead. Is that okay? Enough?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, for the elaboration. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. Well, given the time we have, we just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So, I just wanted to say thank you very much again to the two professors here today for your wonderful talk today. It's really inspiring and enlightening. So I would like to, and also would like to thank all the audience today. I know some of them you joined Bilibili, some of you joined here via Zoom, and we also have some participants here in the classroom. So thank you very much, everybody. So I would like just to continue with Johnson, to quote with Johnson, to end today's event by saying translation is a passion and is a love. So I wanted to end the day by saying, citing Sai Baba, that he says, we normally to start the day with love, to fill the day with love, to end the day with love. And I would like to send all my love and thanks to everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I will end the talk now.